We're going to talk this morning about the difference between sympathy and empathy, particularly when it comes to people who suffer from substance abuse disorder. You know, we used to call that alcoholism and drug addiction, but it's now substance abuse disorder and eating disorders or any form of addiction. What happens in that process of the brain of an addict, and I've worked with lots and lots of different forms of addicts, and I keep waiting for to meet the first one that doesn't feel sorry for themselves just a little bit. You know, when they're in the midst of the disease, it's like, bless my heart, my mother, my dad, somebody did this, somebody did that, the police did that to me, someone is always doing something to an addict, and then they start feeling sorry for themselves. And so, and my mother, she's the best frame of reference I've ever had, and I loved and adored my mother till the day she died. And my mother was a bad alcoholic and prescription drug addict. But my mother suffered, her biggest character defect was self-pity. She felt so sorry for herself, and she taught me to feel sorry for her and for myself. And I've spent the first part of my life, blessing my heart, feeling sorry for myself, full of self-pity. And I think that that's probably one of the ugliest feelings that a person can have, is that self-pity, feeling sorry for ourselves, because, self-pity, usually starts with a resentment. Self-pity does. And resentment is, the means to refill. That's all the resentment is. Sin, S-E-N-T, comes from the Greek word centeri, and R-E is a prefix that means to repeat. And so a resentment is about repeating the feeling over and over. That's what a resentment is. And then, we go from, being mad at someone else for what they've done to us, and maybe we blow up at them or talk about them out in the community or the family or whatever. And then so we get mad at ourselves, so we're mad at them because we have a resentment toward them. Then we get mad at ourselves for reacting to the person. And so that turns into self-resentment. So we're mad at both, them and ourselves. And then we sit on that for a while, and then we get to thinking, well, but they did more to me than I did to them. And so we get into self-pity. Bless my heart, people have been doing me wrong forever. So that is such self-pity. And the Big Book talks about resentment as the number one offender for any form of an addict. But self-pity, it's pour me another drink, or pour me another milkshake. It will get us back quicker into an addiction than anything. Self-pity will. And so sometimes, particularly until an addict has worn people completely out, they usually surround themselves with people who feel sorry for them, people who don't understand substance abuse disorder, which I didn't as a kid, and I didn't until, the addicts, the alcoholics in my life taught me a lot about their disease. And but my primary feeling for the addicts in my life was I felt so sorry for them. And that is sympathy. I had so much sympathy for them. I was one of those dyed-in-the-wool, untreated Al-Anons. I was a codependent before we ever had the word codependency. People in AA would tell me, you are keeping your mother and your husband and your daughter 1 inch from recovery. They will get down and just about ready to surrender their addictions to God, and you swoop in and rescue them. And then you play God in their life. Well, they don't need to reach out to God because, you're, right there in that, blocking that them reaching out to God. And I got a lot out of that. I mean, don't let any codependent tell you that they don't get anything out of the disease, because we do, or we wouldn't, keep doing it. The addicts in my life were addicted to substance, and I was too, which I was so addicted to food. But we didn't know anything about eating disorders and addiction to food back then. So I had a lot of sympathy. I felt sorry for the addicts in my life. And then, they would, get drunk, act out, whatever they did, or cuss me out if I tried to help them, all of that. And then I'd get mad at them. And I'd get so mad at them, and my resentment, my rage would come up. And I never beat my mother up. I wanted to, but I beat my husband up. And I'm not proud of that. And I don't think I ever beat my daughter up, but I wanted to. That anger would come up. So sympathy is a very real emotion. And sympathy is when, you've been around someone that has had a loss. I've mentioned that we've had two friends here in Buffalo Gap just the last month that has passed away. And I've had the whole community has come together. We have a lot of sympathy. We have a lot of concern and sympathy and feeling sorry for those widows and those children and grandchildren that are left behind. And for me as a widow, I can not only have sympathy for these women, but I can have empathy. So the difference between sympathy is you have, feelings, you have a grief for someone's loss, but when you have empathy, you come from a place of knowing. I know what it feels like to be a widow. I know what it feels like to 11 years after you lose a husband to still miss them every day. So that's empathy. And when I walked in to visit, when they had the visitation for both of these gentlemen, the instant that I hugged those widows, both of them said, you know what I'm going through. And we don't know what another person is going through unless we've walked in their shoes. So that's the difference. Sympathy is you have, condolences for someone, you give condolences, you feel sorry for the person, and that really is appropriate to, when someone is having a loss, whether it's a loss of their business or a loss of a child or a loss of a loved one. Now, I can have empathy for widows losing their spouses. I don't have that empathy for people who've lost children. For me to go in, if they've lost a child, and for me to go in and say, I understand the depths of your pain, I would be a liar, because I wouldn't. Now, I could have sympathy for them of their loss, absolutely. But unless I had lost a child, I haven't. And I don't know how you'd even fit that into your brain to lose. And I hope I never have to walk through those shoes. So it would be pretty arrogant of me to tell someone that had lost a child that I understand, because I wouldn't understand, because I hadn't been where they are. So I guess you're getting the difference between sympathy and empathy. So, like I said, sympathy involves the feelings of compassion and sorrow and sadness or pity for another person. And when you feel sorry for someone, you really want to support them, but you can't really get in there and feel what they're feeling. And they know it. And I'll tell you, that's one of the things that people say that, in grief workshops and all that I've been to, that's one of the statements that people who have lost someone that they really resent the most, is when someone will come up and say, oh, I understand your loss, and where they know that they don't, because they haven't lost that particular loved one, So it is about the identification. It's about, and we want to have sympathy for people. But to have sympathy for someone who suffers from any form of substance abuse, and I know this is an ugly word and I shouldn't say it, but it is so strong that I'm going to say it. It will do an addict about as much good as shit or syphilis. You can find that in the dictionary, and it'll do about as much good. Sympathy does not do an addict any good. Now, empathy can. So let's talk about empathy. Empathy is, and I always go back to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill W. really didn't know another sober alcoholic. He didn't. And he didn't, he kind of denied he was an alcoholic. And they didn't even know about the disease of alcoholism back then. But he was in bad shape, physically, mentally, emotionally, financially. He was in bad shape. And his wife, bless her heart, and that is that Southern statement of sympathy, by the way. A Southern statement of sympathy is, well, bless your heart. And I spent my life blessing my heart until I found recovery. That is about sympathy. Bless my heart. So, bless Lois's heart. She gave everything she had to Bill to help sober him up. And nothing would help. Nothing would help. Till one day a man walked into his house who was a friend who he had drank with as a teenager and a young adult, who he knew really well from the inside out. And what his name was Ebby Fletcher. And he walked into Bill's house, and Ebby had found sobriety through a group of people at a church. It was called the Oxford Group. And what he told Bill is, he said, I have found religion and I don't have to drink. I don't drink anymore. And it's got Bill's attention because he knew the type of alcoholic that Ebby was. And so, Bill had already started drinking that day, had already had a couple of drinks, and he wasn't that serious about sobering up. But the seed had been planted in his brain, and it came from one addict to another. And Bill knew that Abby had gone through the same thing that he had. The night sweats, the night terrors, the detox, the having to sleep on the floor, pull your mattress off, or because you would shake yourself to death, in DTs. And they didn't know back then how serious DTs were, that alcoholics could die from detox, and they can today. So, but the seed was planted by Ebby in Bill's brain, that he'd found sobriety and that he no longer had to drink. Now that was the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous. One suffering addict reaching out to another one. And that's what empathy is. That is what empathy is. And when you have gone through the same thing that someone else has gone through, and you can share your experience, strength, and hope about that, they hear it. It creates an opening for them to have a listening for you. But there I was at that time that I was trying to sober up my loved ones. I'd never had a drop of alcohol. I had no idea what they were going through. Nothing, zero. I just made up they were drinking at me, if something that I'd done, that I was too fat, that I was too this, I was too, and what I was too self-centered, codependence and untreated Al-Anons. My gosh, we can just look so long suffering, bless my, that's the Al-Anon salute, bless my heart. And Al-Anons can look and act so long suffering. And I'll tell you, I'm not putting any of us down. It is hard to live in the disease of addiction, whether you're the addict yourself or you're the family member. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to watch a loved one, die a day at a time, whether it's from alcoholism, from overeating, undereating, whatever. I was saying this morning, I read the book, or my friend Misty, when we go on a trip, we like to listen to books. And didn't we listen to Perry?
Yeah, Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry's book. We listened to it on one trip. Y'all know who Matthew Perry is, that was in the Friends. He's probably, in reading about him, he's probably had the worst, the depths of addiction. I mean, the absolute depths of addiction as far as that physical brain and body was. And of course, when you have that kind of money, you can buy any kind of treatment anywhere. You can pay people to come sit with you. You can surround yourself with help when you have that kind of money. And he did. He wanted to be sober while using drugs, and that doesn't usually work. So on the news this morning, I was just flipping through there. That may be why I was a little late here. I don't know. So I spent some time this morning just flipping through and looking at the news. And they're reopening his case because they're saying that he had a higher count of drugs in his body. He was getting some drugs for them to detox him. But anyway, nevertheless, I don't know why I brought that up other than addictions are hard to treat. They are hard to give up. And that man wanted to be sober, but he could not give up the substance in order to feel the pain of the loneliness, the pain of his childhood. And he talked in his book about all the work he had done around his childhood. And we need to do that. We need to get into that core pain and work around, work through whatever happened to us in childhood. But if we're an addict of any sort, at some time we are going to have to grow ourselves up. We can look back at the past and say, that some of those things shouldn't have happened to an animal, let alone a child. And we do our work, our grief work, our core work around it, anger work. But at some point, we're going to have to grow ourselves up and look back and say, so what? Now what? Now, today, I am responsible for the good in my life, me and the God of my understanding, and I'm responsible for the sorry state of my affairs. If I have, problems one way or the other, it's on me. It's no longer on my parents. I am a grown-up woman today, and I have to quit blaming everything in my life about my parents. And so Matthew Perry, he had done all of that work. He had done a lot of work, but he had that substance abuse disorder so strong in his system, he could not give up the drugs. So, and he surrounded himself with people. I don't know that they were recovering addicts. I think some of them might have literally loved him to death. And listen to the story. There was probably one person that would, and I'm not going to tell you the name because it's something, you can read the book and make it up yourself. But anyway, there was probably one person in his life that had more sympathy for Matthew Perry than they had empathy. Maybe, and I make up that they wasn't a recovering addict, and they felt sorry for him and the pain that he went through. And from reading the book, I believe they're the ones who furnished the drugs or helped him get the drugs. So that's what I'm talking about, is people can sympathize and have a lot of sympathy for an addict and help kill them. My little husband, he had no idea what food addiction was. He just knew he married someone that, when we married, I was about the size I am now. And I started regaining that weight in September, right after I said I do, and then I did. I started eating. And by December, I had gained a lot of the weight back. And he asked me one day, he said, we were getting ready to go. I was a little sensitive, folks, but anyway, we were getting ready to go buy Christmas gifts in December, and it was Saturday, and we were newlyweds, and I was excited to go buy, Christmas gifts for our first Christmas together, and he happened to say the wrong words. What he said was, "Are you gaining weight?" And that was not the thing to say to me. And I was, but I was playing like I wasn't, and I sure didn't want him to mention it. And, here I was, 19-year-old idiot, and I ran into the bathroom, and we had a panel ray heater, it's a gas stove. I shut that door, and I turned that heater on, and I was going to kill myself because he said simply, "Are you gaining weight?" I had been a fat girl all my life, and I hated being overweight, but I could not stop the eating. So long story short, it's obvious I didn't, kill myself, because what he said, he kept begging me to come out, begging me, and finally he said, "If you don't come out, I'm going to throw a match in there under the door." Well, I wanted to just lay down and let that gas, put me to sleep and die, because he said I was gaining weight. I did not want to blow up and hurt and then maybe survive through it and be all scarred up. Nevertheless, I opened the door and I came out. And from that point on, and I am not joking, from that point on, my husband felt sorry for me about my weight. He mentioned my weight one more time in our married life. We were married for 51 years. I'll tell you, I taught him well to leave my weight alone. But one time it wasn't quite my highest weight. I was about 260, and we were talking about plans for the future, what we were going to do in the future. And he looked at me and he said, "Honey," he always called me honey, and he said, "Honey, do you think you might want to do something about your weight?" Yeah, I wanted to do something about my weight. I wanted to kill him because he mentioned it. And I got all upset again and, started crying. From that point on, he never, ever mentioned my weight again. And he had a lot of sympathy for me. I'm getting to the point in a minute. And so what he would do is he would buy me lots of candy bars to eat, because he knew if I got upset, if I ate that certain candy, any would do, but there was one that I was really addicted to. It's called a Snickers bar. But he kept me supplied with candy. Now, we had, we had a baby. I had a son, and then he had his three children that lived with us. And so, I was a teenager. I wasn't much past being a teenager, and they were 9, 11, and 13. And it wasn't always pleasant around our house. Here I was trying to be a mother, and I didn't know how to be a mother to half-grown kids. So anyway, he kept the candy in a stash in the top of the, you think about codependency, but he would keep my supply of candy up in the top part of the cabinet in the laundry room, and no one knew it was there. And one day, his oldest daughter, my bonus teenage daughter, who was 13, was looking for something in the laundry room, and she stood up on the counter. We had a big old laundry room then, and she looked up and could see the eye level of that top shelf, and she saw all of my candy. And she got it, and she brought it down and gave it to all the kids. And she said, "Well, I wonder why." She said, "I guess Dad put it up there because he just has a sweet tooth every once in a while, and I guess he hid the candy from us." And I wanted to say, no, that is my drug of choice, and he furnishes me with my drug of choice. And I'm laughing about it, but he did. He did from the last time he said anything about my weight until I found recovery and made him absolutely stop bringing it into the house. he wanted me to have something sweet to eat, so when I'd get upset, he could put it in my mouth and I'd feel better. Now that is sympathy. And sympathy does not do an addict any good. It absolutely can kill an addict. And I sympathized with my husband and my mother. I felt so sorry for them, and my daughter, one of my daughters that was an addict, felt so sorry for her until I got into Al-Anon family group and learned that what they had was a disease, and I didn't need to sympathize with it. But I couldn't empathize because I had not gone down the trails that they were going down. So empathy is different. It's what Ebby had with Bill W. Ebby had been the kind of alcoholic that Bill W. had been. And he knew, and Bill knew, that Ebby knew what he was going through. And so that's what we call the language of the heart. Sympathy comes more the language of the head. You know, you have condolences for someone, and you know that they're going through a hard time, but you don't know it in your heart because maybe you haven't had that kind of loss. But you can certainly be there for them and offer condolences and all, but you can't do that for an addict. You try to do that for an alcoholic, and this is where I get very concerned. We've also listened to Jessica Symptom's autobiography, and I didn't realize she was as bad an alcoholic as she was, but we listened to her book, and it was her friends that finally did do an intervention on her. But she was also surrounded by people that would bring her alcohol, that loved her and was afraid to say anything to her, and they would drink with her. And then, you know, and maybe if I was real wealthy, I would do the same thing. I don't know. But I was in listening with her. You know, what they did, they called the best psychiatrist. They got the best therapist to come and surround her. They brought every treatment to her house. I didn't hear one thing about her going to any kind of a 12-step meeting or, you know, and there's a way you can talk about going to AA without actually using the words AA and breaking, you know, that anonymity, anonymity of the fellowship. But I never heard that, and I think that's one reason sometimes that famous people are not as successful. Not by the grace of God, she has been successful in staying sober, and that's good. But sometimes I think that they're not because they can bring all of these professionals into their home, and they don't have to go out and just find, you know, where it's one addict to another one. That's where recovery comes from, is one suffering person reaching out to another one. You know, I cannot sit with a man or a woman that is either in prison or going to prison or has been in prison. I can't sit and talk with them and say, I know how you feel. I mean, I'd be lying if I did. I cannot say that because I've never been to prison. Probably should have some of the things in the past. I don't know, but I never went. That's not my experience. You know, but when I can talk to someone that, you know, he stayed up all night for days, and eaten and can't stop eating, and can buy food for their little kids' lunch the next day, and get into it and eat all of it, and have to go the next morning and scrounge around to a little old 7-Eleven and try to find something to put their kids' lunch. I can identify with them, and they can identify with me because that's the path that we have walked. You know, I am what you call a very high-bottom alcoholic. I had enough sense when I did start drinking. I knew I could get in trouble real early, you know, and so there are a few of us around AA that are what we call high-bottom alcoholics. now there's some old timers there that will say things like, well, I've spilled more alcohol on my tie than you ever drank, which is true. So you have to get with people who understand and have empathy for you. I quit at a time that, I wasn't drinking a lot. I was just drinking when I was traveling. And I started drinking with a dear friend of mine. We would travel, to Maui or wherever, and she drank wine and taught me into it. It's not her fault that I got to drinking wine. But what happened is I only drank when I went out of town. But I wanted to travel all the time then. I wanted to be out of town all the time so I could travel. So I could drink. So, other high bottom alcoholics can identify with me. And so that, I can claim a seat in AA because what it says, the only requirement for membership in AA is desire not to drink. And so, they have empathy for me. But there were some of the alcoholics there that didn't have a lot of empathy for me. They would say things like, well, we wondered why it would take you so long, because they knew me through Al-Anon and being a professional, and they would joke with me. But anyway, I'm getting way off the subject in that we cannot be sorry for an addict. We cannot feel sorry for them. We may feel so sorry for them, but when we do, what a lot of addicts, particularly when they're not in the, not wanting to recover, they will use and abuse people around them, and they will use and abuse your sympathy. If you sympathize with them and you bless their heart, and they'll hear, they can tell that you are, feeling sorry for them, and they'll say, well, could you pay my phone bill this week, or my rent's due, or I need some groceries, or can I borrow your car? A good addict can hone in on sympathy and somebody that's a sympathizer in a heartbeat. And they will use them to the nth degree in the disease, not in recovery. Hear me, not in recovery. But and also when they get ready to recover, they can get with recovering people, and they will have empathy, and they will hear their story from another addict. I know when I was in treatment, the reason how I got to treatment is I did not know one other human being, one other person, except a couple of my daughters. But that was a secret, and we never told anyone. I've been morbidly obese all my life. I ate myself up to 287 pounds and hated it, and I would lose weight. I'd lose 100, 150, did that 5 different times. Finally, the 5th time took. But that 5th time that I lost the weight, in order to keep it off, I and I won't go into it, but why I was losing a lot of weight is because I'd had that surgery that caused you to have diarrhea, and the body restores itself. I quit having the diarrhea, and I quit losing weight and started gaining it back, and my biggest fear was gaining all that weight back. So that's when I got up in my little pea brain, and I thought, well, if it is the diarrhea that causes me to lose weight, what I need to do is take laxatives. So I did, and it's any drug is a drug, and I started using 2 laxatives a day, and then 4, and then 6, and in the next 13 years, I was up to taking 100 to 125 X-Lax a day. Now people say, oh, how could you do that and not live? Well, I was nearly dead from it. My liver was shutting down, literally shutting down. My colon was falling out of my body. I was sick, and I did not know what the problem was. Now, on an intellectual level, I knew that it was not healthy to take all of those laxatives, but I had never heard the word bulimia. I had never heard that word. I did not know what bulimia was. And by the grace of God, and it's still by the grace of God. It was not by my doings. You know, I was in Overeaters Anonymous. I believed in the 12 steps, but I could not get honest about what I was doing with the food and with those laxatives. I had so much shame around it. I could not tell anyone. And I had this guy come in from LA, hip, slick, and cool, recovering alcoholic drug addict. And I knew his wife. They had been there before and then moved off, but I knew his wife. And we'd been friends for a while. We were kind of binge buddies. She was short and she would overeat. And anyway, but I didn't know him. Anyway, was a therapist, a qualified licensed therapist, and he came and applied for the job. I hired him, and he was a wonderful employee, but one day he came in and asked me if I would meet with him in the library, and I figured he wanted a day off. Anyway, we went into the library, and what he did, in essence, he saved my life. God, working through him, saved my life. He handed me a book called Fat is a Family Affair by Dr. Judy Hollis. Now, Alan did not have an eating disorder of any kind. He was a bad old drug addict and alcoholic. But his wife, when they got to California, she got into bulimia and anorexia and had almost died of anorexia. And I'm sorry to say, she got out of recovery years ago, and she did die of anorexia. But anyway, that's another story for another time. But the fact is, they had a friend in LA that was a psychologist that was getting ready to go to work for Dr. Hollis. She was opening an eating disorder unit in LA. And Alan brought me Dr. Hollis's book and asked me if I would read it. And I went home and I read it that night, and it was the first time in my lifetime, ever, that I read where people were doing with food what I did with food and what I did with laxatives. I read about the binging bulimics, the binging ones that would binge on food and use laxatives to get rid of the food. I saw myself on every page. I saw Judy Hollis, where she was a compulsive overeater and hated being overweight, and like me. Anyway, it takes the empathy. It takes the empathy, someone that has walked the path that you have walked. And that's the first time, the first book that I ever read. I could read books, when I went to school. I could read textbooks about, we heard a little bit about anorexia, but nothing about bulimia, nothing. And so when I got to treatment, I met some bulimics, and now I didn't go to treatment with them because we only had 2 or 3 clients at that time, but the people who were the techs there who drove those vans and drove us to those meetings, they were recovering bulimics, and they would tell me their story, and they would tell me, about how they used laxatives, and I felt like I wasn't sorry, and when I realized I was very sick, and I got help. So anyway, I didn't need to get into telling my story to all of you. I'm just saying, sympathy does not do an addict any good. Empathy does. That's why we must tell our stories to each other. We must share our stories with each other. We don't go out and broadcast it. But if there is a need, and if a person comes to you, or you're invited to go talk to someone, or you're invited to go talk somewhere, go and share your story, because it might touch someone else. Maybe that'll be the first time they'll hear about what it's like to be an IV user, or an alcoholic, or a prescription drug addict, or like me, a bulimic, of sorts. So anyway, that's what I have. I've worn empathy and sympathy completely out, but I thought, I hope that you will, get the idea, the difference between the two, and I know that you do. They're in 12-step programs, you know the difference. And I want to tell you about Ebby. I want to finish up with Ebby. Ebby was human like all the rest of us. He was a human being, and he had feelings. You know, he took the message to Bill. Bill took the message to Dr. Bob. Together they started Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, and they became famous within the movement. You know, Bill W. was the founder of, you know, or co-founder along with Bob. And when you hear people talk about AA, you hear them talk about Bill W., Bill W., Bill W., and Dr. Bob. But you very seldom mention, unless you're talking to a scholar, you very seldom hear mention about Ebby. And Ebby relapsed in alcoholism, and he relapsed for one reason. And I was trying to remember this morning. I can't remember. Jeff probably knows. I can't remember if Ebby died sober or drunk. I can't remember. But anyway, he did drink again. And he said the reason, what he drank over the resentment, that here he took the message to Bill and no one remembered him. No one knew. No one gave him the credit. So for an addict to want credit of any kind, that's dangerous for folks like us. That's why when we treat people over at Shades, and you know, it's good to hear the compliments. What I want to hear is that they're recovering. I do not need to hear what I did for them, because if I hear that much, I may begin to believe my own press. And that's not good for any addict, to put ourselves up there and think we're all of that and something else. You know, we have to stay right size. We have to stay, you know, where God is the answer. It is not us, but we can be the spokesperson. And we can have empathy with other people who suffer from the same disease that we suffer from. All right, that's what I have. I always stop sharing and go to preaching. I've preached a little bit to you. So who would like to share about the difference between sympathy and empathy? Has anyone ever sympathized with you when you were in the midst of your addiction?